Live from London, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Lizzie Burden with your top stories. Jerome Powell vows to stand firm as the Fed is served with DOJ subpoenas threatening criminal indictment. US stock futures fall and the dollar weakens. President Trump says the US is looking at some very strong options as Iran's leadership grapples with the biggest challenge to the Islamic Republic in a generation. Activists say more than 500 people have been killed in the crackdown. Plus, Bloomberg learns European leaders are discussing plans for a military presence in the Arctic as President Trump continues his threats over Greenland. A very good morning. Welcome to Monday, 6 a.m. here in London. And that threat to Fed independence really is rippling through these markets. Wall Street futures and the dollar down, the euro up on the flip side. And we have gold and silver now hitting fresh records, not just on the Fed news, but also fueled by the prospect of regime change in Iran. Now, more risk events for the week include US inflation data tomorrow. Traders all but wiped out bets on a Fed cut this month after Friday's bigger than expected drop in unemployment. We have Marine Le Pen's bid to overturn her conviction and election ban in France, and a raft of Wall Street earnings coming up this week as well. It's going to be a busy one. Let's set you up for the day ahead. We begin with our top story. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell saying that the US Central Bank has been served grand jury subpoenas from the Justice Department threatening a criminal indictment. The move is a dramatic escalation of the Trump administration's attacks on the Federal Reserve.
The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation.
Now, Donald Trump insists he had no knowledge of the DOJ's investigation into the central bank. We can get more now with Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson. Ros, good morning. Just remind us what exactly Powell's being accused of here, and how likely is it that the Fed chair is actually ousted?
Well, this goes back to those allegations from previously about this extensive renovation of Federal Reserve buildings and the allegation potentially that Powell maybe misled Congress in his testimony about it. Of course, the Trump administration has been annoyed by the cost of this renovation, which has blown out. I mean, the Fed says it's a consequence of higher costs than expected for things like labor and materials. This is being led, obviously, by the U.S. Attorney's Office. We know that the U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi has directed her officers to look at cases of potential taxpayer misuse. And this particular case is being run by the US Office for the District of Columbia. The question is, how long does it take for this investigation to go for? Because Powell's term as chair does end in May. Is this more about trying to make sure he leaves the Fed entirely because his time as governor isn't up until 2028? Are they trying to ensure his departure from the Fed in entirety? Of course, you saw that very robust statement from Powell saying he's being punished essentially for doing his job, the Fed essentially doing its job in trying to be independent in setting interest rates. That doesn't sound like someone who's about to back down. So potentially we're in for a really big fight here again between Powell and the administration.
And Ros, as well as the Fed decision later this month, we're also, of course, expecting the Supreme Court to take up the Lisa Cook case, and we're expecting the president to name Powell's successor. So what's the latest on all of those?
Well, that's right. Trump says he's made up his mind. We don't know. He hasn't said who, but we know that, for example, the National Economic Council chief, Kevin Hassett, is a front runner there. It was interesting to see last night that, you know, the Senator Tom Tillis from the Senate Banking Committee, he's a Republican, coming out and saying he doesn't want to push forward with any nominations until these legal matters are addressed. So perhaps does he become an obstacle for Donald Trump in getting his nominee out of committee and into a full Senate confirmation? So it's a very interesting statement to see from that senator overnight on this case. So that's going forward. Separately, as you say, we're going to get oral arguments next week in the case of Lisa Cook, who Trump has been trying to fire from the Fed over, he says, allegations of mortgage fraud, which she denies. These are oral arguments in whether Trump has the right, essentially, to fire Fed officials, including FOMC officials, for cause. She disputes that, his ability to do that, and says even if she had committed the things they say she had, they were done in a private capacity before her time at the Fed. Therefore, there can't be an issue of for cause. So we're going to get oral arguments on that next week. That's going to be very interesting to see in terms of, again, a look at just the reach and the ability and the influence potentially of this Trump White House.
OK, Bloomberg's Rosalind Matheson, thank you so much. Well, let's take a closer look now at how the markets are digesting these attacks on the Fed. We're joined now by Paul Dobson, Bloomberg's executive editor for Asia markets. How alarmed is the market, Paul, at the moment? And really, how alarmed should it be?
Yeah, hi, good morning, Lizzie. So are you hearing from Ross a little bit on the political fallout from this already? In the markets, we did have a knee-jerk reaction, as you were describing. So with the dollar falling with stocks and actually falling with bond futures as well. So all US assets falling in tandem. That's something that we saw last year a little bit as well. That sort of sell dollar or sell US kind of narrative filtering across markets. It speaks to this idea that there's a mistrust of the US administration and the way that it's planning to run the country. And that is because, you know, the action is seen as being trying to undermine the Fed independence, exactly as Powell described it. And actually markets extended further when Powell came out and said, you know, he's very opposed to it, expressed it in much more strong terms than we'd heard previously. Flip side of that is moves are not massive at this point in time. I think it's about 0.5% on US futures. The dollar, yes, it's weaker against everything, and the haven currencies like the Swiss franc are performing well. But on the other hand, those moves are not massive in the bigger picture and the biggest scheme of things, and not as pronounced as we saw when we had similar moves in news this time last, or not this time last year, but in the middle of last year.
So, Paul, is the political risk in the US more of a concern to traders than the geopolitical risks seen around Iran?
I think that's a really interesting one to try to tease out a little bit more. It does feel like the political risk is coming much more to the fore right across the sort of gamut of investing opportunities at the moment. So you have this action against the Fed, but you've also heard in the last week, you know, Trump's interventions with the oil industry, trying to get them to invest in Venezuela, with the credit card companies, trying to get them to charge lower interest rates, with housing as well. He's been ranting and trying to get people to make changes on that. There's, you know, US government intervention in all sorts of different assets at the moment, all sorts of different industries. And that is, you know, from a domestic point of view in particular, and from an international investor point of view, cause for concern. So if you're looking at US markets and you think, God, there's all of this going on at the moment, maybe I'd be safer outside of the US region. The Iran question is really interesting because markets are trying to figure out how extreme and how grave a situation this is there and what that might mean. At the moment, oil production doesn't seem particularly affected, so there's a risk premium building, but it's not extreme. But it does talk to that haven narrative as well, and I think that, you know, the two, the geopolitical risk plus the political risk combined is where it really sort of comes together is with the precious metals, and that's why we're seeing gold and silver catch that really strong bid again today. You've got the undermining of the US dollar, but you've also got the sort of global risks and everybody reaching for a haven asset.
Yeah, silver up 5.6% right now. Both gold and silver, as you say, hitting fresh records. Bloomberg's Paul Dobson, thank you so much for that update. And just checking in specifically on oil, as Paul mentioned, we do have oil holding its gains because of the protests as well in Iran. That really raising the spectre of the disruption. So Brent now up 0.25% at $63 a barrel. Well, President Trump says that the US is looking at potential options in response to those violent crackdowns in Iran. Analysts say they've seen 544 people killed so far and more than 10,000 imprisoned. Donald Trump also said that Iran's leadership's reached out to seek talks and meetings being set up, but the US may have to act before that meeting.
We're looking at it very seriously. The military is looking at it, and we're looking at some very strong options. We'll make a determination.
Let's get more now with Patrick Sykes, Bloomberg's breaking news editor for the Middle East. Morning, Patrick. Are the protests different this time, and how likely is this to be the end of the regime?
Morning, Lizzie. Yeah, the scale is really hard to judge from the outside, particularly in light of these internet blackouts that have been in place since late Thursday. But what is different is the kinds of slogans that you hear on the streets. There is a kind of consensus emerging among protesters. What they're asking for this time around is the end of the Islamic Republic as a system, not some reform of it, not greater freedoms within it, but the overhaul of it as a system. The other difference is the tentative emergence of this purported alternative. Reza Pahlavi, the son of the former Shah of Iran from before the revolution, he's been living in exile mostly in the US since before the revolution that brought in the Islamic Republic, and he had been kind of peripheral for many years, but has emerged really quickly since these protests began as a major voice and trying to mobilize people and trying to mobilize support outside of the country as well. More importantly, it's his name that we hear among Iranians on the streets in their slogans, calling for his return, calling for his role in some kind of future government. As for whether it's the end of the regime, I think domestically, if you look purely domestically, it's certainly a crisis for the regime. But the tricky part is the regime has faced similar crises before, and unfortunately the way it's faced them down has been with ever increasing violence. For now, I think we're in that phase, and the reports we have from over the weekend are certainly indicative, unfortunately, of increasing violence. But it's early as yet to talk about, I think, the end of the regime imminently.
So how would that play out internationally, Patrick? Because clearly this has caught the minds of markets.
Yeah, exactly. If the regime were to fall, I think it would certainly embolden Israel and the US, right, as the primary hostile powers against Iran. But if you look more broadly in the region as a whole, I think there'll be a lot of governments in the GC, the Arab monarchies, in Turkey, in Pakistan, countries like that share borders with Iran, that'll be really worried about the prospect of a power vacuum. That's not to say that they like the Islamic Republic or the policies that it's enacted, particularly across the region in recent years, but there is a sense of better the devil you know, and they'll be concerned about instability around their borders, around potential influxes of refugees, and that power vacuum and what, if anything, may come to fill it as well.
OK, Bloomberg's breaking news editor for the Middle East, Patrick Sykes, thank you so much for that context. Let's now turn to the market moves that we're seeing in Asia. We can go to Winnie Xu in Hong Kong. Winnie, Japan's on holiday today, as we know, but what else is happening where you are?
Yeah, morning, Lizzie. It's quite interesting to see how Asian stocks and U.S. futures moving in different directions today. And that is partly led by how the concerns around Fed independence is driving flows away from U.S. assets and potentially into regions like Asia here. Like you mentioned, Japan is on holiday, but we've got leading gains, the Taiwanese stock benchmark, and also Kospi here also gaining, pairing a bit of earlier gains. But remember, it has been gaining for every single trading session so far this year already, making it the best performing gauge so far this year globally. And we also want to take a look at which sector is leading gains today. As you flip the board and take a look at the tech sector specifically, HS Tech here up more than 2% with gains led by stocks like Meituan and Alibaba. And that's coming after Chinese regulators launched a probe into the price competition in the online food delivery platforms. And analysts are expecting that this is going to put an end to the price wars that have been hurting profit margins of these companies. Also, flip the board and take a look at cross asset in terms of the weakness of the Japanese yen. We are talking about the yen weakening for a fifth day and now trading around the 158 level against the dollar, which is its weakest in about a year. And that has been driven by how local media is saying that Prime Minister Takaichi is considering a snap election, which is rekindling some of the concerns around her fiscal budget. But we'll see how stocks react when markets reopen tomorrow. Back to you, Lizzie.
Winnie, thank you so much for the update. Winnie Xu there in Hong Kong. Well, still ahead, we'll be discussing the current unrest in Iran with Alexander Zanzer, founder of Transatlantic Geopolitics and Technology Observatory Analysis, that platform, and that conversation coming up at 6:30 a.m. London time. But first, we'll talk Arctic security. The UK and Germany pushing for a military presence in Greenland to counter US threats. So all the details on that next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Looking at the futures picture, and we're ever so slightly lower here in Europe. Nothing like the moves expected on Wall Street later. S&P E-minis, for contrast, are down 0.6%. Nasdaq futures down 0.9% off the back of these threats to Fed independence. But as I say, not such a pronounced move expected here in Europe. We can stay in Europe and turn to the geopolitics now. Bloomberg understands that the UK and Germany are leading a European push to discuss plans to increase a military presence in Greenland to show President Donald Trump that the continent is serious about Arctic security. Speaking aboard Air Force One, President Trump insisted one way or another the US will get Greenland.
If we don't take Greenland, Russia or China will take Greenland, and I am not going to let that happen. Sure, I'd love to make a deal with them. It's easier. But one way or the other, we're going to have Greenland.
Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent Oliver Crook joins me now for more. Ollie, is the point of this NATO presence to show Trump that Greenland is well defended, or is it to defend it against Donald Trump?
Listen, I think it's a little bit of both, Lizzie. We should say that I think that a direct military confrontation between the United States and a NATO ally is still a very sort of remote possibility. But in order to build up that sort of troop presence in the Arctic and Greenland, this is part of the United States is sort of great concern about dominating the Western Hemisphere. They want to feel that they are in control from the top to the bottom, from Venezuela all the way up to Greenland, that they're in control in that segment of the Earth. So what the Europeans are trying to do is trying to assuage some of the fear that they have there. You heard there from the President of the United States, concerned that China or Russia could be involved in Greenland. And so as a consequence, the United States wants to take control. We understand now that NATO, and led by Germany and the United Kingdom, are going to pitch a joint Arctic mission in order to try to assuage some of those fears, in order to get some more troop presence in Greenland, in order to deal with some of the fears that the President of the United States has there up there. Now, we should say the German foreign minister will be in D.C. this week. I imagine this conversation will come up. We also have the German finance minister who will also be in D.C. That being said, we've heard from the Danes before. They're very happy with the United States to have an expanded military presence within Greenland. That being said, Lizzie, just before he said that aboard Air Force One, the sentence that preceded that was that the United States is not interested in leasing it. It is not interested in a short-term solution. It is interested in ownership of Greenland. So this is something that he is not coming back from, even in the statements that he made yesterday aboard Air Force One. So we have to wonder, what is this about for the United States? Is it just about Arctic security, or is this also about mineral exploitation within Greenland, or is this about something even bigger, which is about expanding the U.S. landmass, something that Donald Trump potentially wants to have as part of his legacy? If it is those latter two things, any kind of appeasement in terms of more military troops in Greenland is not really going to be the point.
Yeah, our guest later in the hour says that this is about MABA, Make America Bigger Again, to your point about legacy. Yeah. Look, Ollie, if Trump says that the US will acquire Greenland, whatever it takes, what's the mood in Brussels and Europe on the receiving end of that? Has it changed since the threats have been ramped up?
Yeah, well, listen, Lizzie, we're almost marking a year since President Trump's inauguration. It's been a year that has really been marked by sort of geopolitical humiliation for the Europeans. And I think for the Europeans, this sort of last year and going into the future is really a moment of soul searching and trying to figure out their place in the sort of MAGA world sphere. This is something that the Europeans have not yet worked out. There have been a huge amount of changes here in Europe in terms of defense spending in order to get them to a place where they can compete on the global stage. But the truth is they're just not there yet. What the next steps are for the United United States. There have been discussions, and there were reports on Reuters about this, that the United States could look at direct payments of buying Greenland directly to the citizens, payments of anywhere from $10,000 to $100,000 for each person in Greenland. There are about 50,000 or 57,000 people within Greenland. Even at the higher end, at $100,000, that's less than $6 billion in terms of spending in order to buy all of Greenland if it were in the direct payment process. That's basically an rounding error for U.S. military spending. That being said, we did also hear very concerningly from the European perspective from Donald Trump on Friday, where he said the following. He said, "I would like to make a deal the easy way," that is a deal to buy Greenland, "but if we don't do it the easy way, we're going to do it the hard way." And you'll remember, Lizzie, that sounds familiar because that is exactly what he said about Venezuela at the end of November, and we know how that resolved itself about 6 weeks later.
We do indeed. Bloomberg's chief Europe correspondent Oliver Grok, thank you so much for pulling those threads together. Well, coming up, President Trump targets Exxon over its response to his push to extract oil from Venezuela. So we'll get back to that story next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, 6:24 a.m. here in London. Good morning if you're just joining us. Now, to some other top stories we're following for you. President Trump has criticised the oil giant Exxon over its response to his push to extract oil from Venezuela. On Friday, CEO Darren Woods called Venezuela uninvestable during a meeting with the president and oil industry executives at the White House. Trump fired back late on Sunday.
No, I didn't like Exxon's response. We have so many that want it. I'd probably be inclined to keep Exxon out. I didn't like their response. They're playing too cute.
Elsewhere, thousands of people have marched to the site in Minneapolis where a federal agent was shot and killed a woman during a confrontation. Speaking to Fox, Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said that hundreds more agents from Immigration and Customs Enforcement are being deployed to that city.
We're sending more officers today and tomorrow. They'll arrive. There'll be hundreds more in order to allow our ICE and our Border Patrol individuals that are working in Minneapolis to do so safely. We're going to continue to, if they conduct violent activities against law enforcement, if they impede our operations, that's a crime, and we will hold them accountable to those consequences.
Elsewhere, Australia is bracing for catastrophic fire risk in parts of the country on Friday. It comes amid its worst heat wave since the Black Summer bushfires in the summer of 2019 and 2020. The Bureau of Meteorology is currently forecasting extreme or catastrophic fire danger for all parts of Victoria on Friday, the highest warning levels. And the European Union and Mercosur have delivered their long-sought trade pact in a show that broad multilateral deals do remain possible in a global order upended by Donald Trump. The deal with the South American bloc will create a free trade area large enough to rival the decades-old North American arrangement known as USMCA. It'll gradually erase tariffs on agricultural goods and other products. Well, those are some of our top stories that we're following for you around the world. Just checking in on these markets because we do have US futures pointing sharply lower this morning. This off the back of the renewed threat to Fed independence, so down 0.6% on S&P E-minis. Contrast that with the moves we're seeing on Euro Stoxx 50 futures, only flat to the downside. But you are seeing the Fed story playing out when it comes to the commodities space as well. So both gold and silver hitting fresh records. Gold there at $4,575 a troy ounce, but silver, look at it, up 5.7% at this point. It's not just the Fed story, though. We also factor in the geopolitical risk around Iran. And coming up on Daybreak Europe, we will be discussing that current unrest in Iran and really how it could reshape the world if the regime falls. We'll be speaking to Alexander Zanzer, founder of Transatlantic Geopolitics and Technology Observatory Analysis. That conversation coming up next. Stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. Live from London, this is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. I'm Lizzie Burden with your top stories. Jerome Powell vows to stand firm as the Fed is served with DOJ subpoenas threatening criminal indictment. US stock futures fall and the dollar weakens. President Trump says the US is looking at some very strong options as Iran's leadership grapples with the biggest challenge to the Islamic Republic in a generation. Activists say more than 500 people have been killed in the crackdown. Plus, Bloomberg learns European leaders are discussing plans for a military presence in the Arctic as President Trump continues his threats over Greenland. Well, a very good morning. If you're just joining us, it's 6:30 a.m. here in London. Your markets look like this. Futures sharply lower stateside on the threat to Fed independence. Not such pronounced moves here in Europe, but we are seeing the dollar lower as well. Euro dollar benefiting on the flip side, and gold hitting a fresh record, not just on the threat to Fed independence, but also the geopolitical tensions around Iran. Silver too hitting a record high as well. Well, on the front pages this morning, the Financial Times has the EU demanding that any future British government pays significant financial compensation if they quit a post-Brexit deal negotiated with current Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Brussels clearly bracing for the possibility of Nigel Farage replacing him, given that the Reform UK leader is topping the polls. And then if we turn over to the Wall Street Journal, they've got US prosecutors investigating the Fed chair, Jerome Powell, which Powell has said is a pretext as part of President Trump's pressure on the Fed to cut rates. And then finally, here in the UK, the Times has Trump weighing up military strikes against targets in Iran, saying that the US is locked, loaded and ready to go. So those are the front pages, but you can get a roundup of all the stories you need to know to get your day going in today's edition of Daybreak. So, of course, as always, Terminal subscribers can find that by going to DAYB Go. Well, as I say, we have US futures dropping on concerns over the Fed's independence after Chair Jerome Powell said that threats of a criminal indictment were a consequence of the central bank's interest rate policies. I'm joined now for more with Mark Cranfield, Bloomberg's MLive strategist. Morning, Mark. So does the market reaction here to the Fed probe suggest that traders believe Powell is actually going to be ousted? Good morning.
Good morning. I'm not sure it's a question that they think he's going to be ousted before his term is up. I think it's more that it's a huge distraction for him and the other members of the Federal Reserve, which could stop them doing their main job. Obviously, they're supposed to be there to analyse the data, to come up with the best reading of monetary policy for the benefit of the US economy. Well, if they're going to be spending a lot of time defending themselves against court cases, then that's going to take away their ability to be able to do their right job. And that's weakening the credibility of the Federal Reserve at a time when some people are suspecting that they're not on the best footing anyway. So you're seeing the kind of reaction. We had a mini sell America reaction today. We had a weakness in the US dollar, weakness in equities, as you were talking about. And although it's a holiday in Japan, there's no cash treasuries, but the futures market was slightly lower for treasuries as well. So clearly, investors taking this as another reason to be defensive, which they already were, considering all the geopolitical issues which are going on, particularly with the ramp up in terms of Iran. People getting very nervous that something could happen there that will be detrimental to risk assets in the near term.
And Mark, as you look across the FX reactions, we've talked about the euro dollar reaction, but why is the yen lagging behind?
That's got a lot to do with the potential for a Japanese election, an early snap election. There's been a lot of talk over the weekend that Japan will dissolve parliament pretty soon, that they will go ahead and have an election probably in mid-February. Prime Minister Sane Takaichi thinks that she's in a pretty strong position. She's having this dispute with China. There's a back and forth, particularly over minerals in China and the availability of rare earth products for Japanese companies. That's getting a nationalistic spin on things, which is helping her case, but is not much good for the Japanese yen. So today you've seen all of the G10 currencies improving. Swiss franc was the leader during the Asian session, with the euro not far behind, and yet there was the yen lagging behind and pretty weak. There's not much chance that if an election is coming soon, you can't expect Takaichi to get in front of it and say, I want a really strong currency. She'd be more concerned about supporting the stock market, which needs a slightly weaker currency. So for the time being, there's nothing much on a domestic front which is going to come and support the yen. Traders can see that, so they're quite happy continuing to sell the yen and buying other G10 currencies.
And Mark, just going back to the Federal Reserve, of course, President Trump would like cuts sooner rather than later and more of them. We had the jobs data on Friday. We've got inflation data coming up this week. Just walk us through the outlook for cuts at the moment.
You've got an extremely divided Federal Reserve. You can see from the last two meetings, they could hardly agree. They did lower interest rates, but there was a lot of dissent on what was coming. So we are going to get an inflation report this week. It looks as though it's going to be unchanged from the previous period. It's not going to give us a lot of new information, but some people will jump on that and say that the inflation numbers are low enough for the Federal Reserve to go ahead with another 25 basis points cut. But it doesn't look by any means a certainty. And the fact that now you've heaped pressure on Jerome Powell with these court cases as well, that is going to make it even more complicated for making a clear decision when the Fed sit down at the end of the month. So the data is becoming a little bit secondary unless we get a huge miss. If there's a big downside surprise on the inflation data, that will stir the market. But aside from that, people will probably be much more concerned on how the politicians, how the Fed, how everybody involved is going to deal with this investigation into the Federal Reserve.
OK. Good to see you, Mark. Our first time together on air in 2026, so I don't mind saying Happy New Year. Bloomberg M Live strategist Mark Cranfield there. Well, turning back to the geopolitics now, after weeks of protest in Iran, global leaders are grappling with the possibility that the Islamic Republic could be overthrown, which would, of course, upend global geopolitics and energy markets and risk widespread chaos. Alexander Zanzer, founder of Transatlantic Geopolitics and Technology Observatory, which provides analysis on US-Europe relations, I'm pleased to say, joins me now. A really good morning to you, Alexander. When we look at the developments here, President Trump has repeatedly warned Iran that the US will strike if peaceful protesters are killed. The death toll is mounting here. What's going to be the trigger then for US involvement?
Well, the difference between the former uprisings in 2009, which was an uprising due to presidential elections, but in 2019 due to the high prices of oil, which the government decided, there is a huge difference now. First of all, the total crush of the currency. And everybody understands that when a currency goes down, it's very difficult to get it up again. Another one is that the US-Israeli strikes in June show that it's possible and even probable that somebody will attack from outside to support a change of regime. And there is also the declared potential new regime under Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah. And most importantly, and this is the biggest difference, is the determination of President Trump shown in the Venezuela case. So all the elements are in place for a final battle. And the United States cannot permit itself not to, let's say, profit from this situation in order to engage itself in a regime change that will change the entire environment in the Middle East.
Well, you mentioned what's happening in Venezuela. I do want to try and get into the mind of Donald Trump here, Alexander. We've also had his threats on Greenland. What does he really want from Greenland? Because I know you've been writing that it's about MABA, making America bigger again. Is it not really about security, not really about minerals, but actually about legacy and making America bigger?
Exactly. Legacy is the biggest position that President Trump wants to achieve, but there are logics behind it. And what I'm about to say is at the very least controversial, but it cuts to the point beyond political declarations. Greenland is a bride with many suitors. It should master the art of the deal, like Donald Trump calls it, engaging in every irrelevant party to negotiate the strongest possible outcome for its population in its long-term future. But they have also to understand, if the moment passes and everything reverts to the status quo, there may come a time when Greenland regrets losing the attention it receives now and the opportunities it failed to seize. So Donald Trump looks at this as a case of, let's negotiate. Of course, there are threats, but for him, it's extremely important to make America bigger again for the 250th anniversary of the country And for Greenlanders, it's a tension they can use. How controversial this is, there could be a deal made here.
And so what should Europe's response be here? Is it wishful thinking to think that at this point Europe's going to unite and strengthen in the face of that threat? And should European leaders like, for example, Keir Starmer here in the UK stop, frankly, appeasing President Trump?
Well, in Europe, every leader has its own problems. Keir Starmer has an issue in the United Kingdom for its own position. The French president has issues economically and stability of his political systems. So Europe has to negotiate with President Trump. It has to support Greenland, but support Greenland not militarily. It's not by sending soldiers to Greenland, so-called to support the anti-Russian or the anti-Chinese improbable invasions of Greenland, but to support a little bit the situation there so it doesn't evaluate or change into a Venezuela scenario. It is all about negotiations. There is very little chance that President Trump will invade Greenland. Greenland is not Venezuela. There is no risk, there is no regime change, there are no immigrations. And of course, if Greenland negotiates its well with the support of the Europeans, it could get not 100,000 per person, but at least 1 million. And also the situation about social security, which they're afraid of because the United States is totally different from where they are now. There should be a way to find a solution for this. These are financial negotiations more than military negotiations. And Europe has to understand that it needs the United States, it needs it enormously, and the United States cannot afford on long term to lose Europe. So an agreement can be found, but not through sending soldiers from left and right to invade Greenland from every point of view. It should speak with the Greenlanders and what they want for the future and what they can get out of this deal.
OK. Alexander, really great to get your perspective this morning. Thank you so much there. Alexander Zanzer, founder of Transatlantic Geopolitics and Technology Observatory. Well, coming up on the programme, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz is in India, meeting his counterpart Narendra Modi on his first visit to Asia. We'll be discussing what it means for German business next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. Now, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has met India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi on his first trip to Asia since assuming office last year. He's accompanied by a large group of German business leaders, including CEOs of Siemens, DHL Group, Infineon and others. And I'm pleased to say we're now joined by Bloomberg's Sudhi Ranjan Sen in New Delhi for more on this visit. Good morning to you, Sudhi. Just talk us through what these German businesses are hoping to get out of this trip and how they're going to be received in India.
Well, I mean, how they're going to be received, no doubt it's going to be a very warm welcome because India sees the German relationship as, you know, as important or as big or as valuable as a relationship it has with Japan, with the United States, although that's not working too well right now. But that's the kind of priority that Germany gets today in India. And India is looking out looking out and looking to Germany for access to technology, for German companies coming up, partnering with India. So it's the red carpet is going to be rolled out for the entire German delegation.
Well, you mentioned the relationship with the US. To what extent can better relations between the EU and India compensate for trade that's been lost to US tariffs?
Well, I mean, that's the idea that, you know, the government, that New Delhi and government of India is working with. Now that the US market or United States is not a very dependable ally, there are too many disruptions in trade. They're looking at the European Union to compensate. Now, whether that is going to be enough or that is going to be completely be able to take over and absorb the entire goods and services that was going to the United States. Mind you, for India, United States is its biggest export market. But what it can definitely do is lessen the blow that has come from the United States with 50% tariffs, one of the highest across the world. It can lessen that blow, and that's what New Delhi is working towards.
And what about the elephant in the room here, India's ties to Russia? Do you think Merz will bring that up?
Well, the chances are there will be a discussion. In the past, we have seen these discussions happening one-on-one, and it's been Germany and the other European countries kind of trying to wean India away from its dependence on Russia. There has been some development, but India is still not wanting to completely, give up Russia, condemn Russia. We haven't seen India condemning President Putin for his war in Ukraine as yet.
OK. Sudhi, thanks for being across that visit for us. Bloomberg's Sudhi Ranjan Sen there. Thank you so much. Now to some corporate news this morning. HSBC's asset management arm has been given the green light to open a branch in the United Arab Emirates, allowing it to tap one of the world's fastest growing wealth markets. HSBC is pivoting to Asia and the Middle East, even as it exits businesses in the West under CEO George Eldhari's overhaul. The bank's Asia and Middle East CEO Daisy Ho told us more about those plans.
We are the first one amongst all the global asset managers to obtain a license from the local regulator, Securities and Commodities Authority, to provide investment and portfolio management services. So we are now setting up a UAE branch based in Dubai and offering a range of onshore funds.
Elsewhere, Allegiant is to acquire Sun Country in a cash and stock deal valued at $1.5 billion. The combined entity will provide more than 650 routes, including 18 international destinations. The deal is expected to close in the second half of 2026, bringing together two relatively small carriers that have primarily focused on offering direct flights to price-sensitive US vacationers. And Indonesia and Malaysia have become the first countries to ban Grok AI over its generation of sexual content. Indonesia's Ministry of Communications and Digital Affairs imposed a temporary ban on Saturday aimed at protecting citizens from faked pornographic content. Malaysia's internet regulator followed suit, saying it's limiting access to Grok until effective safeguards are implemented. Well, those are some of our top corporate stories this morning. We have Wall Street banks kicking off earnings season with some momentum this week, underpinned by strong trading conditions, improving investment banking fees and a more supportive US regulatory output. So JP Morgan will be the first to report tomorrow. Turning back to other top corporate news now, President Trump's demand that credit card issuers cap their interest rates at 10% for a year is taking aim at a crucial business line for the banking industry. It's part of the president's recent focus on reducing consumer burdens, including announcements aimed at lowering housing costs. Banking industry groups warn many Americans would lose access to the cards completely if rates were slashed. And here in the UK, according to a closely watched survey, UK employers cut back hiring again in December. The Recruitment and Employment Confederation and KPMG said that permanent staff placements fell at the steepest rate since August as businesses grappled with rising costs and weak sentiment. Meanwhile, a separate report says that City of London firms held back on hiring in the final quarter of last year as uncertainty around the UK budget led to a 13% drop in job vacancies compared to the previous period. And for the first time in at least a decade, a home seller in London now is more likely to make a loss than any other place in the UK. According to a report from estate agents Hamptons, about 15% of Londoners last year sold their home for less than they bought it. That was well above the national average of 8.7%. Well, let's check in on these markets because we are tracking these moves in US futures, sharply lower this morning. S&P E-minis down 0.6%, Nasdaq futures down 0.9% on the renewed threat to Fed independence, and that's spilling over into your commodity space as well. So we've seen gold and silver hitting fresh records this morning. Gold there at $4,576 a troy ounce. It's not just about the threats to the Fed, though. It's also about the geopolitics. We are seeing the protests in Iran continuing, the death toll mounting. Will the US intervene here in the situation there? It is a question that the traders seem to be grappling with this morning as we see this flight to risk assets. So gold and silver both hitting fresh records this morning, but not such pronounced moves here in Europe. In fact, Euro Stoxx 50 futures are now flat to the upside. We've got plenty more coming up for you on Daybreak Europe, so stay right there. This is Bloomberg. Good morning. Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. In our last few minutes together here, let's just take a look at some charts to set you up for your trading week. It's a big week for earnings. We've got $2.9 trillion of market cap on the S&P 500 reporting this week. Bit of a prelude to the big week that's coming up later on in the month. But this is the week that's really crucial for Wall Street earnings. So flip the board over and you can see that JP Morgan and Bank of America are among the biggest US banks that are expected to post slower sales growth as the trading boom tapers out. So you can see here total trading revenue growth for those as things stand. But of course, the situation has been changing throughout 2025. Now, speaking of banks, if we flip over to the picture here in Europe, actually, banks have been outperforming. They've been crucial for the European rally. And you can see the banks here in the white line outperforming the Stoxx 600 in the blue line. And that has led to outperformance in particular for the Spanish IBEX and the FTSE MIB in Italy. So to what extent can that continue in 2026 will be a big question for the year. But these charts and all the others that you've seen on Bloomberg TV so far, you can find on the Bloomberg terminal by going to CHRT TV Go. Well, bank earnings aren't the only risk events coming up on the docket this week. It's going to be a busy one. We've also got, of course, US CPI. That comes on Thursday. And here in Europe, we have the trial of Marine Le Pen trying to overturn her conviction and her election ban ahead of the 2027 presidential election. So that hot on the docket when it comes to France as well. All of that will be broken down in the next hour of Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. The opening trade coming up. We've also on Bloomberg TV got a big interview for you to watch. Senator Elizabeth Warren, the ranking member on the Senate Banking Committee, will be joining Bloomberg's Balance of Power. So don't miss that conversation at 10 p.m. London time. But that does it for Daybreak Europe. Anna, Tom and Guy will take you all the way to the European market open next. See you tomorrow. This is Bloomberg. Good morning from London.